In an instant, thousands were gone. Thousands more changed forever. Yet few outside Canada know of the day Halifax was nearly wiped from the earth. The year was 1917, and the Great War had torn through Europe for 3 grueling years. Canada, a loyal dominion of the British Empire, had been sending men, munitions, and hope across the Atlantic. Halifax, Nova Scotia, stood as the eastern gateway to war. Its harbor, the second largest natural one in the world, was bustling with wartime activity. Troop ships, supply vessels, and convoys lined the docks. Barracks were overflowing. Children played among the clanging shipyards. Soldiers waved goodbye from the decks. Halifax had grown into a war machine, but also a fragile one. The city thrived on the edge of chaos. Ships laden with high explosives routinely passed through the narrows of the harbor. It was only a matter of time before something went terribly wrong. And on December 6, 1917, it did. On that cold Thursday morning, 2 ships approached the narrowest stretch of Halifax Harbour, the aptly named Narrows. The SS Mont Blanc, a French freighter, had crossed the Atlantic from New York. It was a floating bomb carrying over 2,900 tons of explosives, picric acid, TNT, benzol, and gun cotton, destined for the battlefields of Europe. Its captain, M. Le Medec, was nervous. The Mont Blanc had arrived too late the previous day to pass through the submarine nets. Forced to wait overnight, he knew the risks of his cargo. By regulation, the ship flew a red flag and carried no pilot on board, a sign of danger to all. Approaching from the opposite direction was the SS Immo, a Norwegian vessel leaving Halifax after delivering Belgian relief supplies. It was lighter, faster, and impatient. Miscommunications and navigational confusion mounted as both ships entered the Narrows around 8:45 a.m. At 8:46 a.m., they collided. The impact was minor, but the consequences were cataclysmic. The Immo struck the Mont Blanc near the bow, igniting benzol barrels that spilled across the deck. Flames leapt into the morning sky. Panic gripped the Mont Blanc's crew, who abandoned ship in lifeboats, screaming warnings to anyone who could hear. But few in Halifax understood the danger. Crowds gathered at the waterfront, drawn by the burning ship. Children pressed against windows. Workers paused. Soldiers watched from barracks. A nearby telegraph operator, Vince Coleman, sent a frantic warning to stop an inbound train. Then at 9:04:35 a.m., the Mont Blanc exploded. The blast was heard over 300 kilometers away. A massive fireball rose into the sky, and a mushroom cloud towered over the city. A shockwave flattened buildings within a 2.6-kilometer radius. Over 1,600 people were killed instantly. Another 9,000 were injured, many by flying glass as windows shattered miles away. 300 people were blinded. The Richmond district was completely destroyed. Halifax looked like a war zone. Homes were gone. Schools vanished. Streets were rivers of blood and rubble. Fires erupted across the city. The blast had dislodged a 1,140-ton ship, the Mont Blanc's anchor, over 3.5 kilometers from the harbor. One of the largest man-made explosions before Hiroshima had just occurred in a peaceful Canadian port town. The explosion shattered not only glass and brick, but entire families, memories, and lives. But even amidst the smoke and screams, heroes rose. The silence that followed the blast was haunting. It lasted only seconds, but to the stunned survivors, it felt like eternity. Then came the screams, thousands of them. Mothers calling out names. Children trapped in schools that were now piles of timber. Bloodied workers stumbling blindly through smoke. Animals, too, ran wild in fear. The city was not only broken, it was on fire. Entire blocks in Halifax's north end were engulfed in flames. Wood-framed homes burned like kindling. What the explosion didn't destroy, the fire threatened to finish. And in that moment of despair, Halifax's second great trial began: rescue. In the chaos before the explosion, one man made a choice that would define Canadian heroism. Vince Coleman, a railway dispatcher at the Richmond rail yards, had just learned from panicked sailors that the Mont Blanc carried explosives. His colleague fled, but Coleman remained. He knew an incoming passenger train, train number 10, was just minutes away. He could have saved himself, but instead, he tapped out a message on the telegraph. Hold up the train. Munitions ship on fire in harbor, making for Pier 6. Goodbye, boys. Moments later, the blast killed him instantly. But his message worked. The train stopped just in time, saving over 300 lives. Vince Coleman became a national hero, one of the first names etched into the soul of Halifax. Thousands were dead or wounded. Among them were families crushed in their homes, workers killed at the docks, and school children lost under debris. At the Richmond School, over 500 students were in class when the explosion hit. Nearly all were killed or injured. Churches collapsed during morning services. Trams were thrown off tracks. Horses exploded mid-trot. Survivors wandered the streets covered in ash, dust, and glass. Many half-naked, clothes stripped by the shockwave. The Mi'kmaq community at Turtle Grove, near the harbor's edge, was completely wiped out. Their tragedy was nearly forgotten in official records, a silent loss within a larger one. Entire neighborhoods were gone in a blink. Communication lines were severed. Roads were impassable. It took hours for people outside Halifax to understand what had happened. But soon the rescue began. First came the Halifax militia, then naval crews, then civilians, thousands of them, digging, lifting, carrying, comforting. Priests gave last rites on street corners. Nurses worked by candlelight. That night, snow began to fall. A brutal blizzard slammed Halifax, covering the wreckage in ice and further slowing rescue efforts. For those still trapped under debris, the cold became the next killer. But help was coming. Fast. Word of the explosion spread across Canada and into the United States. When the city of Boston heard the news, they sprang into action. Within hours, doctors, nurses, supplies, and equipment were being gathered. A relief train was on its way, cutting through snow and darkness. Boston's generosity was immense. Its people gave money, medicine, and manpower, asking for nothing in return. To this day, Halifax sends Boston a Christmas tree every year in gratitude, a glowing symbol of international friendship born from ashes. Some stories from that day are burned into Canadian memory. Barbara, or a young girl, was pulled from her collapsed house alive after 2 days. George Wright, a Halifax millionaire and philanthropist, was killed in his home, the blast having stripped his mansion bare. Dr. William Duell, despite being injured, performed surgery nonstop in makeshift field hospitals. Soldiers of the Royal Canadian Regiment, though many were injured, joined the recovery before help arrived. There were also dogs that dug through rubble, horses that hauled wounded, entire families that took in strangers. Tragedy had turned Halifax into a city of survivors and heroes. The scars of the blast didn't just lie in shattered buildings or broken bones. They lived in memory, in grief, in how Halifax chose to rise again. In the days following the explosion, Halifax resembled a battlefield. The snowstorm that arrived on the night of December 6th covered the wreckage in white. For some, it provided a moment of stillness. For others, it sealed the fate of those still buried beneath the ruins. More than 25,000 people were left homeless. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Morgues couldn't keep up with the dead. Schools, churches, and public halls became shelters and triage centers. The sheer scale of loss was beyond what any city, especially one as small as Halifax, was prepared for. And yet, Halifax did not collapse. It organized. The Halifax Relief Commission, formed within days, coordinated aid, housing, and reconstruction. Donations poured in, not only from Boston and other American cities, but from across Canada, the UK, and even far-flung allies like New Zealand. The response became one of the first modern examples of coordinated disaster relief. In the wake of tragedy, grief often turns to blame. A public inquiry was launched almost immediately to determine who was at fault for the explosion. The captain of the Mont Blanc and Le Medec and the ship's pilot were initially arrested. So too was the naval officer who had authorized the Mont Blanc's passage into the harbor. At the heart of the case was one key question: who had the right of way? The inquiry ruled that the Mont Blanc was solely to blame, a decision that satisfied political needs more than truth. The captain of the MO, despite breaching navigational protocols, escaped serious punishment. Years later, courts in both Canada and Britain softened that stance, recognizing that multiple failures on both sides, combined with wartime urgency and poor communication, had led to the disaster. It was a tragedy of errors, not villains. Reconstruction of Halifax was not just physical. It was emotional, cultural, and symbolic. Entire neighborhoods had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The Halifax Relief Commission oversaw one of the largest urban renewal projects in Canadian history. It built new homes, redesigned streets, and created Hydrostone, a now famous district using fireproof concrete blocks. The explosion also transformed medicine. Halifax became a center for ophthalmology, with many of the 300 people blinded in the blast treated by pioneering doctors like Dr. George Cox, who developed new methods for dealing with glass injuries and eye trauma. New emergency protocols were developed. The Canadian military and Red Cross refined disaster response strategies. Cities across the Commonwealth studied Halifax to prepare for their own emergencies. And every year, Halifax remembered. Amid the grand narratives, many smaller tragedies were nearly erased. The African Nova Scotian community of Africville suffered deeply, receiving far less relief and recognition than white Haligonians. The Mi'kmaq people of Turtle Grove were almost entirely killed, and the government later declared the land abandoned, claiming it as Crown land without compensation. These injustices are still being reckoned with today. In recent decades, historians and activists have worked to restore the memory of these marginalized voices, reminding us that disaster does not discriminate, but recovery often does. The Halifax explosion remains the largest non-nuclear, human-made explosion in history. It destroyed 2 square kilometers of city, killed almost 2,000 people, and injured over 9,000. It left behind shattered glass, broken families, and an indelible memory of both devastation and courage. And yet, outside Canada, few know its name. This makes it one of the most powerful, untapped stories in the history of human tragedy and resilience. Every December 6th at 9:04 a.m., Halifax observes a moment of silence. Church bells ring. A siren echoes across the harbor, and a city remembers what it lost and what it became. Movie camera, if you've made it this far in the video, you now know about one of the most powerful and emotional stories ever hidden in history. There is a reason the story of Halifax remains compelling more than a century later. Because in a moment when the world burned, ordinary people became heroes. And because sometimes it takes destruction to reveal the deepest truths about human strength, sorrow, and survival. Disasters don't end with explosions. They echo through generations in the lives touched, the silence left behind, and the stories passed down. One of the most haunting and enduring images of the Halifax explosion came from a girl who never saw it coming. Anna McNeil, only 9 years old, stood in her schoolroom at the moment the Mont Blanc exploded. Like many that morning, she had been drawn to the burning ship in the harbor and had rushed to the classroom window to see. When the blast struck, shards of glass tore through the room. Anna survived, but she lost both eyes. Her case became emblematic of the 300-plus people who were blinded by shattered glass that day, leading to Halifax's emergence as a leader in blind rehabilitation and eye surgery. Out of her tragedy came medical breakthroughs that would later save sight around the world. Anna went on to become a teacher for the blind. Her life, like many others, turned pain into purpose. In the ruins of Halifax, messages were found. Personal letters, notes, and even last words written in haste. One poignant note came from James Duggan, who scribbled a goodbye to his wife while trapped beneath debris in their collapsed home. His body was later found still clutching the message. In another case, a soldier stationed at the Citadel Fortress penned his final journal entry just minutes before he was blown out of the guard post. Miraculously, he survived, and his journal, bloodied and torn, was later displayed at the Army Museum. These fragments of history offer more than facts. They give us emotion, voice, and intimacy in the face of catastrophe. Among the dead were 600 children, a figure almost unthinkable. Entire families were erased, generations cut short. The Vinot family lost 10 members. The Campbells, who lived near Pier 6, were reduced from 13 to 2 survivors. Children had been in school, at breakfast tables by windows. Many were never identified. Their bodies were buried in mass graves, marked simply as unknown. To walk through Mount Olivet Cemetery or the Fairview Lawn Cemetery today is to see name after name, age after age, some as young as 11 months, gone in a flash. Each stone is a reminder. The Halifax explosion was not just a historical event. It was a human catastrophe. Before December 6, 1917, few in the world had considered what a civilian port explosion of that scale could do. The Halifax explosion changed that overnight. The British Admiralty issued new regulations on shipping explosive cargo. Naval and civilian traffic in ports was restructured across the empire. Emergency response protocols were modernized in both Canada and the U.S. Military logistics adopted lessons from Halifax in wartime planning. Later, during World War II, when ports like Bristol and Clydebank were bombed by the Luftwaffe, their emergency plans had been inspired, at least in part, by what Halifax had endured. Even atomic scientists, decades later, referenced Halifax in their studies of blast radius and pressure damage. The explosion had, unknowingly, become a precursor to the nuclear age. Today, you can walk through Halifax and trace the scars and the stories. The Halifax Explosion Memorial Bell Tower stands in Fort Needham Park, where the ground still bears the shock. Hydrostone Market, built to house the homeless, is now a vibrant community. The Maritime Museum of the Atlantic holds a permanent exhibit on the explosion, featuring relics, stories, and even fragments of the Mont Blanc. In Boston, a plaque remembers the aid sent by train in 1917. And every December 6th, survivors, descendants, students, and citizens gather for a moment of silence. Some still tell stories passed down from grandparents who witnessed the blast. History lives, not in textbooks, but in the people who remember. Clapperboard before we continue. If you found this story as powerful and eye-opening as we have, please hit that subscribe button. Your support keeps real history alive. This channel tells true stories that textbooks forget. Stories like the Halifax Explosion, the Tulsa Massacre, the Bhopal disaster, and more. Subscribe, comment, and share, because history deserves to be remembered. The final official numbers from the Halifax explosion were staggering. 1,782 confirmed dead. Over 9,000 injured. 6,000 people left homeless. 25,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. $35 million in damage. Over $700 million today. But numbers only tell part of the story. What truly matters is what the explosion revealed. That in the face of unspeakable destruction, human dignity, courage, and compassion can still shine. It showed how strangers become neighbors, how cities rebuild, and how pain becomes history and, eventually, strength. On December 6, 1917, a city was nearly destroyed. But in the rubble, Halifax found something extraordinary. Not just sorrow, but unity. Not just ruin, but rebirth. And that's why we still tell its story today. What do you say to a child who watched the sky collapse? What do you do when your world ends and you survive? Decades after the explosion, those who lived through it still carried it in their bones. Ethel Ross, a Halifax nurse, remembered, the sky turned black. It was like the end of days. I saw grown men crying, covered in blood and dust, looking for their children. Charles Campbell, just 10 years old at the time, said, "There were no birds for weeks. No sound, only wind and silence. Even the trees looked afraid." Many survivors lost not just loved ones, but their voices. The trauma was so profound, so consuming, that many never spoke of the event again. Generations later, families would discover diaries, photos, and medals tucked in attic trunks, tokens of a horror buried deep within the soul. And then there are those who could never bury it. Hundreds of children lost both parents in the explosion. Halifax's orphanages overflowed. The Halifax Protestant orphanage itself was struck by the blast. 30 children and 5 staff members were killed. Survivors, some just toddlers, were taken in by distant relatives or placed in institutions for life. Many never knew their family names. Decades later, during the 1990s, a genealogy project uncovered the stories of these forgotten children, revealing fates both tragic and uplifting. Some became soldiers in World War II. Others remained in Halifax and quietly contributed to its rebuild, their own trauma hidden behind ordinary lives. They were the lost children of a lost generation. In 2017, Halifax marked the 100th anniversary of the explosion. Thousands gathered under the December sky to listen as descendants, historians, and civic leaders paid tribute. The Nova Scotia mass choir sang solemn hymns. Bells tolled. Sirens wailed at 9:04 a.m., the exact moment the Mont Blanc exploded. Among the attendees were great-grandchildren of Vince Coleman, descendants of Mi'kmaq families lost at Turtle Grove, Boston officials, honoring the century-long friendship forged in fire and snow. That centennial was not just remembrance, it was reckoning. For the first time, public apologies were issued to Black and Indigenous communities for being ignored in early relief efforts. Memory became justice. The Halifax explosion is one of the deadliest non-nuclear explosions in human history, but it is not alone. Disaster year fatalities cause. Halifax Explosion, Canada, 1917-1, 782-ship collision plus explosives. Texas City disaster, USA 1947, 581 cargo ship explosion, ammonium nitrate. Port Chicago disaster, USA 1944, 320 naval munitions explosion. Beirut port explosion, Lebanon 2020, 218 ammonium nitrate warehouse. These disasters share common themes: mismanagement, miscommunication, and underestimation of risk. They also reveal a crucial truth. Disasters are not always natural. They are often man-made, and they are avoidable. What happened in Halifax became a grim lesson studied by governments, militaries, and safety agencies worldwide. Trauma does not die with the survivor. It lives in their children and their children's children. Halifax sociologists have documented a phenomenon among families affected by the explosion: high rates of anxiety, depression, and hypervigilance, even generations later. Children grew up in homes where silence reigned, where grief was hidden. A few families even passed down explosion drills, unofficial instructions on how to respond to loud bangs or shaking glass. These stories are now being studied in universities, recognizing the Halifax explosion as an early case of intergenerational trauma, a concept more often associated with war, genocide, or slavery. In the decades after 1917, the explosion began to fade from public memory. It was mentioned in textbooks, sure, but rarely in depth. It took survivors' memoirs, poets, documentary filmmakers, and grassroots historians to bring it fully back. Some key milestones. 1989, CBC airs Shattered City, a dramatized miniseries about the explosion. 2004, a graphic novel titled The Great Halifax Explosion introduces younger audiences to the tragedy. 2011 to 2017, survivors' descendants begin publishing family stories, letters, and journals. 2017, centennial events spark global awareness and digital archiving projects. Thanks to their work, Halifax is no longer just a footnote. It is a case study in disaster, response, and resilience. Why do we remember the Halifax explosion? Not because we enjoy pain, but because we honor strength. Not to relive trauma, but to prevent its repeat. This story is more than history. It is a call to humanity, a reminder to respect danger, to care for neighbors, to plan for tomorrow, to listen when someone says a ship is on fire, and to remember the names that might otherwise be lost to time. Clapperboard, if this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel. We uncover powerful, untold human histories. Your support allows us to bring stories like Halifax to millions around the world. Back-end index pointing right like. Comment. Share. Let people know that this happened. Pushpin and tell someone today about Vince Coleman. About Barbara or about the little boy who asked, "Where is the sky?" Because if we remember them, then they're never truly gone. In times of disaster, the measure of a people is in how quickly they answer the cry of stranger. Boston heard Halifax, and it ran toward the fire. As Halifax lay in ruins, word of the explosion began to spread, slowly at first, then urgently, via telegraph and wireless messages. It reached Ottawa, Montreal, New York, and finally Boston. At City Hall, the message was brief. Halifax needs help, immediate and great. Boston had no obligation, no treaty, no military alliance that demanded action. And yet, within hours, Mayor James Curley, Governor Samuel McCall, and the Massachusetts Public Safety Committee had gathered resources, summoned doctors, loaded boxcars, and assembled a disaster relief team unlike anything North America had seen. By midnight, they were ready. In the early hours of December 7th, 1917, a blizzard descended on New England. Snow piled on tracks. Wind lashed the train cars. Still, the Boston relief train left North Station, heading north through the dark. It carried dozens of surgeons, nurses, and firemen, tons of medical supplies, food, blankets, and bandages, construction workers and telegraph crews, stretcher bearers, clergymen, and even morticians. The train fought through whiteout conditions, moving slowly but relentlessly. Towns along the way cleared tracks, cheered, and offered more supplies. The mission became personal. New England was saving its northern neighbor. At 3 a.m. on December 8th, the train finally reached Halifax. The city wept. When the Boston team arrived, they found a city broken beyond belief. Entire neighborhoods gone. Survivors sleeping in snow. Churches used as morgues. They went to work immediately, setting up mobile hospitals, organizing mass burials, performing emergency surgeries by lantern light, distributing clothing and food, reconnecting scattered families. For weeks, Boston volunteers lived in Halifax, enduring cold, exhaustion, and emotional strain. They treated hundreds of patients per day and trained local staff for long-term recovery. They never asked for praise. But Halifax never forgot. In 1918, as Halifax still recovered, a small group of citizens sent a Christmas tree to Boston, a simple gift of thanks. The tradition was revived decades later and continues to this day. Every year, Nova Scotia sends its best spruce, cut with ceremony and gratitude. The tree is placed on Boston Common and lit as a symbol of friendship forged through tragedy. To Bostonians, it's a festive decoration. To Haligonians, it's a promise. When we needed you, you came. The Halifax Explosion was born from war. If it hadn't been for World War I, the Mont Blanc would never have been loaded with 2,925 tons of munitions. The urgency to keep supply chains moving, the lack of harbor safety coordination, the pressure to clear routes quickly, all these were byproducts of wartime strain. The Mont Blanc was carrying 200 tons of TNT, 2,300 tons of picric acid, extremely unstable, 35 tons of benzol, 10 tons of gun cotton. Even a spark could ignite disaster, and that's exactly what happened. Historians later noted that Halifax had become a ticking time bomb, one of several Allied ports handling explosives under minimal oversight. What occurred was not merely accidental. It was systemic failure under the weight of war. One of the most debated figures in the tragedy was Francis Mackey, the harbor pilot aboard the Mont Blanc. Mackey knew the danger. He saw the MO approaching. He tried to maneuver, but never sounded a full-scale harbor-wide alarm. Why? Because protocol didn't exist for such a scenario. The red danger flag was visible, but there was no law requiring explosive ships to inform the port in advance, nor any protocol to clear surrounding areas. Halifax had never imagined an accident of this scale. Mackey survived the blast. He was arrested, but later exonerated. He lived quietly until his death, haunted by the knowledge that one shouted warning might have emptied the shoreline. Amid the chaos, one woman became a legend in Halifax. Matron Lilias McPherson of the Camp Hill Hospital. She was on duty when the explosion struck, and despite being injured by falling glass, she worked nonstop for 72 hours, tending to victims, organizing volunteers, and turning the shattered hospital into a lifeline. When new patients arrived, she'd already learned their names from friends. When bandages ran out, she tore up curtains. She slept for the first time on December 10th, 6 days after the explosion. To survivors, she was a guardian angel. To Halifax, a symbol of feminine fortitude in wartime. As Canada recovered, the Halifax explosion prompted sweeping changes in port regulations. Mandatory disclosure of explosive cargo. Designated danger zones. Revised ship traffic protocols. Special training for harbor pilots. Creation of civilian-military joint safety boards. Across the Commonwealth, other ports followed suit. Even the Panama Canal Authority rewrote its transit regulations after studying Halifax. Later, when nuclear energy was developed in the 1940s, blast models from Halifax were used to predict shock waves and damage patterns. In a grim twist, the Mont Blanc's explosion helped build the framework for preventing nuclear-scale disaster. The Halifax explosion taught the world 5 key lessons. 1. Complacency kills. The warning signs were there, but ignored. 2. Communication is survival. Misunderstandings sank the harbor. 3. Heroes are ordinary people. From Vince Coleman to Matron McPherson. 4. Gratitude lasts generations. Boston and Halifax still share their bond. 5. History forgotten is history repeated. The story must be told again and again. If you're still with us, thank you. You just heard one of the most powerful stories in human history. Please consider subscribing to this channel. We bring real, emotional, world-changing stories to life, from forgotten disasters to silent heroes. Speech balloon, drop a comment. What shocked you most about Halifax? Push pin share this video. It might save a life someday. Remember Halifax. Remember the warning. Some disasters end in silence. But Halifax found its voice in paintings, novels, films, and the classroom. This wasn't just history. It was a story that had to be told. As the fires died and the rubble was cleared, artists began to do what no camera could: capture emotion. Arthur Lismer, a member of Canada's famous Group of Seven, painted the aftermath in dark, brooding tones, blackened skies and skeletal buildings rising from ash. Sketches emerged showing children clutching one another amid ruins, wounded mothers searching for their sons, naval men silhouetted in firelight. In 1918, local painters depicted the burning Mont Blanc adrift in the harbor, a ghost ship moments before detonation. These paintings weren't just art, they were witnesses. They said, "We were here. This happened." They gave faces to numbers, sorrow to statistics. Over the years, authors, both local and global, have turned to the explosion as subject and symbol. Some of the most notable works include Barometer Rising, 1941, by Hugh MacLennan, a classic Canadian novel intertwining family drama and national identity with the explosion's chaos. The Great Halifax Explosion, 2017, by John U. Bacon, a gripping nonfiction account that blends science, human drama, and global consequences. Tides of Honor, by Genevieve Graham, a historical romance highlighting the war's impact on Nova Scotians, centered around the blast. These books brought the Halifax story to readers far beyond Canada. Through character, dialogue, and narrative, the event took on a new life, living through fiction, surviving through prose. While less prominent than other wartime tragedies, the Halifax explosion has made its way onto screens, large and small. Shattered City, CBC miniseries, 2003, a dramatized version of events, focusing on multiple characters and political tension. Documentaries by History Channel Canada, PBS, RSN, and BBC. These focus on historical accuracy, survivor testimony, and explosive science. YouTube creators and educators have increasingly told the story in bite-sized, powerful formats, reaching younger generations who might never pick up a textbook. Yet even today, many filmmakers still say Halifax is Hollywood's forgotten disaster. The emotional power and cinematic potential remain largely untapped. Could you, dear viewer, be the one to tell it? Music, too, help Halifax mourn and remember. Traditional Nova Scotian ballads soon included lyrics about the ship that split the sky, the boy who sent the wire, Vince Coleman, the glass that stole our eyes. Modern Canadian artists like Joel Plaskett and the Rankin Family have written songs alluding to the explosion, songs about resilience, tragedy, and rebirth. Even choirs today sing specially written works during December 6th memorial services, with lyrics drawn from survivor diaries and soldier letters. In Halifax, remembrance is more than silence. It is sound, harmony, reverberation. For many years, the explosion received surprisingly little attention in schools. Teachers, uncomfortable with its graphic nature and tragic child death toll, chose other topics. But in recent decades, that has changed. The Halifax Regional Center for Education now includes a full unit on the disaster in its 6th and 10th grade history programs. Virtual tours of the Maritime Museum's Halifax Explosion exhibit are now part of Canadian classrooms. Survivor recordings are used in English classes to teach empathetic listening and historical fiction writing. Some teachers even bring in descendants of victims to share personal accounts, making history real, raw, and close to home. In the 21st century, new platforms are giving voice to old stories. Podcasts like History Extra and Canada's Dark Past feature deep dives into the explosion, often including little-known survivor stories. TikTok educators and history-themed Instagram pages now tell the Halifax story in under 60 seconds, drawing millions of views from a generation raised on scrolling. Google Earth features an interactive blast zone map overlaying modern Halifax with 1917's destruction radius. As digital storytelling evolves, so too does the legacy of the Halifax explosion. It becomes more accessible, more intimate, more powerful. This is history in your pocket. It's easy to forget a disaster when no one talks about it. But Halifax made a different choice. It chose to remember loudly, creatively, permanently. The city didn't just rebuild structures. It rebuilt stories. Streets were renamed. Memorial plaques installed at schools and harbor fronts. Parks and monuments became classrooms for reflection. Artists and teachers became modern-day town criers, shouting the truth for the next generation. Because remembering wasn't just about history, it was about humanity. The explosion took so much, but gave something too. It gave Halifax a legacy of resilience, a blueprint for emergency response, and a global reputation for survival and solidarity. More than that, it gave future generations a story not just to cry over, but to learn from. The sky once burned, Haligonians say, but we walk beneath it today, whole and grateful. If this series has opened your eyes, do one thing today. Tell someone else about the Halifax explosion. And please, subscribe to this channel. We work hard to preserve the past through the lens of truth, emotion, and courage. Can share this video with a teacher, a student, a history lover. Speech balloon, drop a comment. Which chapter hit you the hardest? History matters. Memory matters. Halifax matters. The past doesn't always whisper. Sometimes it screams. The question is, do we listen? Long before the term post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, entered the vocabulary of medicine, it was living silently in Halifax. Survivors, especially children, developed night terrors, sudden phobias of loud noises, a lifelong aversion to glass and windows, deep-rooted anxiety. At the time, they were called nerves hysteria or simply shell shock, a term borrowed from soldiers on the Western Front. But Halifax had its own form of psychological warfare, one fought in silence, inside living rooms and behind hospital walls. Doctors noted a rise in depression, withdrawal, and even suicide among survivors within a year of the blast. It would take nearly 80 years for the psychological wounds of the explosion to be properly studied and acknowledged. Today, Halifax is considered a case study in civilian trauma psychology. Following the explosion, port cities around the world re-examined their own vulnerability. Halifax became the case zero for a new international push-in: explosives regulation, port zoning laws, evacuation protocol design, emergency drills in schools and hospitals. Nations who once dismissed civilian disaster planning as unnecessary or peacetime luxury began rewriting their manuals. By the 1930s, most Commonwealth countries had civilian defense strategies, modeled in part on Halifax. Even during the Cold War, the United States civil defense training films referenced Halifax's destruction when demonstrating blast shockwaves and mass casualty triage. One explosion had changed the language of safety across the globe. Beyond the statistics and historical accounts lie those whose stories were never told, the ones who carried Halifax inside them without ever speaking aloud. Among them, a priest who never again rang a church bell, a Mi'kmaq elder whose family was erased and land taken, a young woman who left Halifax and never returned, even in death, instructing her ashes be scattered in the Atlantic. Many survivors, especially from marginalized communities, weren't counted in the final death toll. Their names were lost to poor record-keeping, racism, or social neglect. Today, memorial projects work to restore those forgotten legacies. Digital memory walls, community-named parks, restored grave markers, oral history recordings passed to local museums. Because healing history means hearing all of it. The explosion in Beirut, Lebanon, 2020, eerily similar to Halifax, reminded the world how fragile port cities remain. Beirut's warehouse, like Halifax's Mont Blanc, held ammonium nitrate. It exploded with a force felt across countries. 218 people died. Thousands were injured. And again, we asked, how did this happen again? It is in this moment that Halifax becomes more than a ghost story. It becomes a warning. Proper labeling saves lives. Transparent oversight prevents tragedy. Preparation isn't paranoia. It's protection. Across disaster science, Halifax is now taught not just as an event, but as a lesson plan. We don't always get to choose the legacy of disaster, but we do get to choose what we build from it. Halifax built safer cities, better hospitals, braver citizens, deeper empathy. The city rose with grief in its soil, but resilience in its bones. And because it remembered, it grew stronger. And because it told its story, the world became wiser. It was December 6th, 1917. The sky broke. Time split. And Halifax fell silent. But in that silence, something else rose. The voice of a telegraph operator named Vince. The strength of nurses who never left their posts. The heartbeat of a city that refused to be forgotten. Now, more than a century later, we remember not because we must, but because it honors who we are. And in remembering Halifax, maybe we save the next city before it burns. If this series moved you, educated you, or opened your eyes, please consider subscribing to this channel. Our mission is simple: real stories, deeply told. Bell subscribe, share, and comment with what part touched you most. Books if you're a teacher, a student, or a storyteller. This is your history too. Use it. Share it. Keep it alive. From all of us, thank you for remembering Halifax.